you are all here tonight to hear Tom talk about a 2-week bike and hike discovery of New York State's Adirondack Park, which has thousands of lakes, over 100 mountains, and new and old growth forests. And it preserves about 2.5 million acres of land. Tom talks about it as being the North Shore with mountains, which sounds pretty cool to me. Tom's been bicycle touring nearly all of his adult life, and he took a 7-week bicycle honeymoon trip from Alberta to Utah. He's ridden across the US and did an 1,100-mile tour of England and Scotland with his daughter. He's also directed youth development programs and run summer bike programs and taught kids bike repair. He spends his time in nature, not just biking, but also in a kayak and on cross-country skis and on his own 2 feet. So welcome, Tom.
So yeah, I mean, when I first started touring through the Adirondacks, it seemed like, to me, it was like Minnesota. There are lakes and woods and stuff, but then the mountains. So it's a really added dimension. I mean, the Adirondacks are a pretty impressive place, and I think it has all the things that rovers like to do. There's biking, there's hiking, there's backpacking, there's rock climbing, there's paddling, so there's fishing. So it's just a wonderful place. So hopefully you'll enjoy my kind of very brief pass through and limited exposure to it, but I'll share you what I experienced. First, I want to talk a little bit about the park. Like I said, it's a huge place. I mean, there's this 2.5 million acres that are like forever wild, but the whole Adirondack Park is over 6 million acres. It's a 100-year-old park, so it was only established 20 or so years after the Yellowstone Park, and it was really a pretty interesting kind of political solution to things. I mean, for many years, back to even before our country was formed, both the native folks and the French and the British were eyeing and using and being in the park for its natural resources, mostly furs and minerals and trade. But then kind of at the beginning of the mid-19th century, people really began to understand nature for its own sake, its beauty, and what all that gives, and not just a natural resources, extraction thing. So at that point, there was enough kind of private development that people were worried about this gem being lost. So eventually they came up with this solution, which was called Adirondack Park. And essentially today, all the land within that, even both private and public things, are managed by a regulatory agency. So you can't do whatever you want if you're a business owner or landowner. There's some rules and regulations. There's 2,000 miles of hiking trails, and as you can see on this little diagram there, it encompasses the size of all these major national parks in our country. There's so much wilderness in that. It represents a good chunk of all the wilderness on the East Coast. And the regulatory agency has really divided the public lands within the Adirondack Park into those 5 uses. So wilderness, primitive, canoe, wild forest, and intensive use, which is, probably in what we know as state parks. There's developed campgrounds and things like that. So what kind of the impetus for me to go here was that my nephew got married farther south in the Hudson River Valley. So if I'm driving 20 hours, like, what am I going to do in the neighborhood? So I found out that the adventure cycling people had a route that went through the Adirondacks, which is a great place to kind of kick off planning for me. So I used that and then did a little adding and changing to kind of make it my own. But my trip was, of course, over the course of 12 days, about 600 miles, and I used a couple of resources for the biking part. There's an Empire State Trail system, which I'll talk about in a little bit, and then the Adventure Cycling Association has this Adirondack Park Loop. If you're a bicyclist and haven't heard of adventure cycling, they have mapped about 40,000 miles of routes across the U.S. They're like the AAA of the bike community. So if you like to do, explore things and have a lot of the research done for you, check out Adventure Cycling. So I started, the wedding was about 70 miles or so south of where I was going to start bicycling. And so I got the opportunity to really will drive up the Hudson River Valley, which is a gorgeous place, just a gorgeous place. And then in that sightseeing, the first thing I did was visit the home of Thomas Cole, and he was a 19th century landscape painter. There was this movement called the Hudson River School that really maybe were the first group of artists in the country that really focused on landscape painting. And it was that time in the time in American history and kind of thinking about nature, where there was this shift between, again, as I talked about, the nature as resource and kind of a scary place I don't want to go into, to something that people really valuing for itself. So I think they were intent on capturing the valley as it was, but there was also some like allegories. There was some American myths that were driven to that. But I think the valley, to me, and the beauty of it is just the really precise and realistic depictions of the valley. So, and I got to visit his home and see some of his paintings. It was really kind of cool. And then later in the 19th century and then early on in the 20th century, the New York elite found the Hudson River Valley as a great place to escape from the city. So Cornelius Vanderbilt, who built a lot of railroads and other kinds of things, had a mansion there. FDR had his home Campobello in the valley. So I got a little taste of some of that traveling north. So for the kind of the first and last parts of my trail, my trip, I used the Empire State Trail system, and really is a system of 3 different trails. It's the what's called I need to move this here so I can see. There's the Hudson Valley Greenway, which runs from New York to Albany, and then there's the Erie Canal Way, which runs from Albany to Buffalo, kind of paralleling the Erie Canal for the most part. And then the third segment is from Albany up to the Canadian border, which is called the Champlain Valley Trail. So I took, I started in a town called Hudson, which is about 30 or so miles south of Albany, took that into Albany, and then started heading west along the Erie Canal Way Trail. And this was, nope, move on here. This was part of the Hudson Valley Trail. I mean, very, very bucolic, and most of the trail was gravel, but really well maintained. And then when you got closer into Albany, into the suburbs, you were on city streets and it was all paved stuff, but still very pleasant. The signage was really good. It was, it was easy to stay up on that. And then once I hit Albany, I got to cycle along the river up to the confluence of the Hudson and the Mohawk River, and then turn west. So as you can see, the paths were beautiful. This seems like a pretty new system, and they were very smooth and paved, and you had these great river views, and sometimes you're in the forest, so there's this nice diversity of sightseeing as you pedaled along. And one of the neat things, going westward towards Buffalo, was to see some remnants of the Erie Canal. So on the photo on the left is one of the locks, and then on the right is just some of the canal passage that remains. So once I hit the town of Amsterdam on the trail, I left the trail and got onto roads and headed north into the park. From that point, kind of river level, and this was the second day that I actually got into the Adirondacks. There was kind of a continually climbing up from the river level up into the Adirondacks. It was probably an afternoon's worth of climbing. And generally, the western part of the Adirondacks is considered kind of more hilly than mountainous, and I found that to be the case. Like when you would climb or go up hills, the grades were like 3 to 7% or so, not super steep. My dog is he's whining. We'll see how long I can last here. So I was there very early in May, the kind of the second and third week of May, and at that point, not much of the Adirondacks was open. Most of the things seemed to open up around May 20th. So not the state campgrounds, the developed campgrounds weren't open. Not very many of the hotels and lodges were open. So I really, for the first few days, I had to do some primitive camping. And this was one of the places I camped at, which was called Chubb Lake. Because I was I had a fully loaded touring bike. I had to be kind of cognizant of where I was going to end up each day. So I was looking for campsites and places like that, and even hikes that were relatively close to the road that I could get to. So the first day of camping, it was planned that I would just take my bike on the trail, and I was willing to walk or push my bike a quarter mile to the campsite. And I got in about 50 yards, and the trail was not anywhere in any condition to take a loaded touring bike. There were roots and rocks and all that kind of stuff. So I had to kind of stash my bike in the woods and carry my panniers in probably a quarter mile, and all my sleeping gear. My arms were just full of stuff, but found a wonderful place along this Chub Lake, and spent my first night in the Adirondacks. So I wanted to do some hiking as well, not only biking. And fortunately, there are lots of places to hike there. And this was one place that was really right off the road. It's called Watch Hill. It's probably a mile climb up to this viewpoint. And you get a sense of what the hiking trails were like, throughout the Adirondacks. A lot of roots and things like that, and rocks, and but still very beautiful. And then I got to the point of Watch Hill and had this really beautiful viewpoint. It was hard to leave and go down because it was such a great day. I mean, I lucked out because it was early May. My nephew who lives there said it could be beautiful or it could be 40 and raining, and I lucked out. The weather was in the 70s. Actually, maybe some days hit 80. It was pretty warm, but great for biking. Then a few days later, I went and climbed Blue Mountain, which is one of the taller mountains, at least in this area. I think in the Adirondack Park in general, there are about 45 or so peaks that are over 4,000 feet. I mean, they're not huge compared to the Rockies or the Sierras, but high enough that some of them are in alpine territory. I think the highest peak in the Adirondacks is Mount Marcy, which is about 5,300 feet. This climb was a 2-mile hike up to this point, but it was almost, you were climbing, going up almost immediately. It was about a 1,500 elevation gain from the trailhead up to the summit. And then what was neat here was that there was a fire tower, which they have fairly recently opened up to the public. So you can climb up to the fire tower and get this 360-degree view of the Adirondack landscape. Then back down on the road, this was it was called Raquette Pond, near Raquette River, which is near the town of Tupper Lake. I mean, this was the place where I had maybe the only regret of my trip, is that right before I stopped and took this picture, I passed a kayak rental place, and I said, "No, I'll do that later." And I mean, this is just a gorgeous wetland, and the clouds. And it was just a wonderful day. I'm just kind of kicking myself I didn't go back and put my bike down for a couple hours and paddle through all this stuff. It was really, really wonderful. So being there very early in the spring, I got to really witness, this spring flora, which was beautiful. In the center, the Carolina Spring Beauty, that flower, the white and purple flower, was about the size of a quarter. I mean, that was kind of ground cover. Just these lush flowers that were spread along the forest floor. I'd seen the hobblebush all throughout my trip in the area. It's a really kind of broad-armed, broad-leafed kind of bush with these beautiful flowers. So that was kind of the delights, the natural delights on a micro scale, but then also along with the lakes and the mountains. There were just these natural textures. I mean, it was early enough in the season that not all the trees had leafed out. So, all these various shades of greens and grays and stuff was just stunning. And then along with that, you look up in the sky, and then there are the clouds. You saw the one set of clouds at the Raquette River. This was after a climb up to another mountaintop, and this was right after a rainstorm. And what you can't see, I wish I would have taken a video, was these clouds. It was just like this kinetic, swirling mass of clouds that changed, and just drifted by your eyes. It was, kind of mesmerizing for the 5 or 10 minutes as these clouds rolled through. And then just these, shapes and textures and colors that were out in the wilderness. I just get struck by seeing these juxtapositions of all kinds of natural elements. So once I got up to kind of near Lake Placid, it was the kind of the northern limits of my route. I turned eastward and headed towards Lake Placid, headed for this place called the High Peaks Wilderness. Lake Placid is, the Olympic venue. It's a pretty touristy town. There wasn't much going on there at that point because, again, it was early in the season. So I just kind of cycled through that, heading to this wilderness place to do some more hiking. But it was hard to miss these things. I'm trying to think of the scale. I mean, I don't know, 5 stories, 10 stories high. These were humongous. The ski jumping venue. My brother and sister-in-law had gone through the Lake Placid area a few years before and talked about doing some kind of dry run bobsledding. I didn't see that, but I wasn't going to take the time to do that. But those kind of opportunities may still be around if you want an Olympic experience. And then they may do that in the winter as well. I don't know. But I was headed into this place called the High Peaks Wilderness, which is one of the more very, very used but more populated, or not populated, but wilderness parts of the Adirondacks. I was going to a place called the Adirondack Lodge, which is kind of a base camp. It's run by the Adirondack Mountain Club, which has been around for 100 years, and they have it's a base camp to do sites, and they do programming. They can teach you outdoor skills and stuff like that. And this was an easy kind of 1 mile climb up to this Mount Joe, which is right near the lodge where I stayed. And this is the Heart Lake, which is right outside the lodge and on their property. Even when there's clouds and no sun, it was a gorgeous place. But I took a day off. I'd climbed a couple mountains already, and I wanted to get a little different experience of the Adirondack. So I talked to the local guides there, and they said you should really go up to Avalanche Lake. It's a pretty stunning experience, and it was probably I'm trying to think of how long the hike was. 4 or 5 miles, maybe one way. First traversing along some rivers, and you have to climb over this little avalanche pass, and you come to this lake, which almost looks like it's something out in the west. Really fun hiking. There are these sheer granite walls, and if you want to traverse around the lake, what you have to do is follow these boardwalks and ladders, and you're climbing over these boulders that have tumbled down the cliffside, that are as tall as you are. So it was a fun scramble. I think the guide said, this is one of his most favorite hikes in the area. I was hoping to maybe get to one of the higher peaks here, but there was some forecast of rain and storms and stuff, so I tried not to venture. I didn't venture up past this point, but this was certainly satisfying enough to do as a day hike. It was early enough in the season. I was climbing the pass, and it was a much of a forested and sheltered place, so there was still some ice and snow I had to traverse. Again, adding to some beauty, kind of unexpected beauty that I wasn't think I would see in early May. So after leaving the High Peaks Wilderness, I headed eastward. It was largely started heading downhill, lots of downhills, and following the roads were following streams and rivers, and ended up in Lake Champlain, and then started heading south. And actually, this part of the trip, the final 3 or 4 days, was probably my least favorite one, because this part of the Adirondacks is much more dense and populated. More traffic. I mean, I was lucky going there in early May, which is pre-season, there was not a whole lot of traffic. I can imagine going there in high season and being on a bicycle, even though there were shoulders and things, it would be a lot more traffic. So I think I lucked out in terms of weather and then the time of year that it went. But you just get a more sense of, what kind of the human impact on the Adirondack Park is here. In addition to Lake Champlain, there's Ticonderoga, and the scenery got different, still pretty, but much more rounded and gentler. And then you come across some of the American history here, these really old graveyards with cool gravestones. Another kind of fun thing I ran into was this town of Graphite. It was in the late 1800s, 1920. It was one of the major places for graphite farming, mining. And then what happened was that graphite was turned into the Ticonderoga #2 pencils that we all use in grade school. So kind of a blast from the past, and right up to this town, we're just isn't much anymore, just some kind of mobile homes, but just to realize that connection between my childhood and where my all my scratchings came from. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the accommodations. Obviously the first 3 days I went camping, and this was my campsite on Chubb Lake. I was able to find that because of a really great website by the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation, which is probably like our DNR. They had this great GIS website where if you look on the right side of that screen share, you can choose what kinds of things you want to pop up on the map. So I had chosen primitive campsites, and then you can zero in on one. It tells you how many they are and all that kind of stuff. But you can look at scenic views. You can look at developed campgrounds. I think there's probably another tab was for trails and probably canoe routes. It was just a wonderful resource to really, if you wanted to go out into the wilderness, you knew what you were getting into. And for me, as with limited ability to kind of backtrack and go somewhere else, it was really helpful to me to know I could find something along my route. This is one of the I wanted to camp. I wanted to go to some of the iconic places in the area, and this was one of them. This was Hotel Adirondack, which probably in some iteration, maybe not, this building is over 100 years old. It was on this place, Long Lake, which is very long, and beautiful views up and down the lake. My opening slide was a picture along Long Lake, and it was just a fun place. I think there were a lot of locals there, and they had lower and upper verandas. You could talk to people. I had a nice evening conversation with a motorcycling couple who we talked about commonalities and differences between our modes of travel. So and good food, and the interiors are moose heads and things like that, very old and rustic, and the rooms are pretty old, and I mean they have all the amenities, but they're not brand new. It's just a kind of a fun and charming place to stay. And this is where I stayed in the High Peaks Wilderness, the Adirondack Lodge, and you notice it had a kind of a funny spelling, and that came about because over the course of time, this place got sold and resold, and it was eventually bought by the Lake Placid Club or something like that. And the founder of that, his name was John Dewey or something. He was really a proponent of kind of phonetic spelling, so he thought lodge was the correct way to spell lodge. So it still is. So it has a funny name. You'll never forget the Adirondack Lodge because of the way it's spelled. But it's on this kind of grounds complex. There are various ways to stay here. You can stay in the lodge. It holds about 40 people. They have 16 lean-tos. They have 32 campsites. They have 6 canvas cabins. So you can stay on their property in many different modes of your choice. This was the interior, again, beautiful and stunning. I again, being early in the season, I was one of, I think, 3 people staying in the lodge that night, so I kind of had the whole place to myself, and the staff would come and stoke the fire, and it was just really great. Let's see, the fourth type of lodging I did was warm showers. And if you're not a cyclist, you might not have heard of warm showers. It's this fabulous kind of international, it's now a nonprofit. It basically is like a free Airbnb for cyclists. It's people who open up their homes to cyclists for free. And there's a website, and you just look in the area and you see where you want to go, and you kind of message that person and tell them when you're coming, and they say yes or no. And basically they guarantee you a place to stay, but often they will give you a meal, a breakfast or lunch or both, and there's always good conversation. As opposed to like Airbnbs where a lot of the owners are not present. These people are living in their houses and they're interesting. They think cyclists are interesting people, so you have good conversations with them. This happened to be the place I stayed right a little bit east of Lake Placid. It was owned by a couple. The guy was an entomologist and a map maker. And this red building is where I stayed. It was an old ice house that they converted into this living space. And then when you go inside, you had to climb this really steep ladder up to get up to the loft where the sleeping arrangements are. So quirky and fun and memorable, and really, really cool. And then my other warm showers place was in Schenectady, which was like 30 miles east of Albany. This is where I stayed both at the beginning and the end of my loop through the Adirondacks. This was a kind of right near, close to the river, and is a 1857 house. And Joan, the woman on the left, was the host, just very charming and wonderful, and, cooked breakfast for me both times. And I had also the fun experience of, on my return trip, there was a young English cyclist who was beginning his trip across the United States that was also staying there. So we had a dinner together and some nice conversation. And this was the accommodation in one of the primitive campsites. I just had to take a picture of it. I thought this was great. They'd be very nice. You just have to sit on a metal canister, but in honesty, it wasn't much more comfortable than a metal canister, but a great conversation piece. So that's it. I thought I'd throw in a little bit of, kind of movement of some of the bike trails and some of the scenery that you got a moving picture of the Adirondacks. But do folks have any questions?
Yeah, Tom, I'm curious. Obviously, you stayed some places where you could get food, but how did you manage your food? Where'd you get provisions? Did you shop? Did you take a lot of dried food?
Well, the first 3 days, I camped the first 3 days because it took me to the fourth day to find a place at Adirondack Hotel that was open, that I could stay indoors. So dehydrated foods. I mean, there are towns throughout the park, and there were convenience stores and things like that. But so it's possible to reprovision yourself, especially during kind of high season. But I was never without food. There were some restaurants, not too many at my point, but once it's up and going after May, like May to Labor Day, I'm sure you can find whatever you want there. They're happy to have tourists. One thing I did mention, I talked a little bit earlier about, all the different things other than biking or hiking. I'd read about there's a 138 mile, let me go back a little bit, 138 mile backpacking trail that goes through the park. There's maybe a 90 mile canoe route, and that even connects to a longer one that skirts through part of the park. So, lots of lakes to navigate, and 2,000 miles of trails to backpack. And as you saw from that DEC website, tons and tons of campsites. I think the western part of the park is much less visited and populated. So if you wanted to go there and really get a more, away from wilderness experience, that would probably be the place you would want to go.
So Tom, I wondered what you did with your bike and your gear when you went hiking.
Just stash it in the woods. I mean, again, it was early in the season. I brought cables and locks. I tried to put it in a place where people couldn't see it. I guess I'm not, I have a lot of faith in like bicyclists and hikers that my stuff is going to be there. But I took some precautions. I've heard of some people that I remember hearing a talk about doing the Superior hiking trail, and the guy would just, take his bike in the woods and just throw it, and it would be there at the end of his trip. So, yeah, it was there. I made it all the way around. I got it back. All my stuff was there. I did fine.
Great.
There's I was cautioned a lot about bears, and I don't know how specific they were. Maybe once you get north into the high peaks wilderness there. I mean, if you're camping, you have to have a bear canister, but I didn't see any bears. I didn't see any major animals, maybe some deer. I mean, there were some loons there. But it is, there, as they advertise, there's some pretty remote and wild places. So you have to watch out for who you're sharing the land with.
So Tom, did you go to any of the alpine level peaks?
No, and I don't know at what level alpine starts. The highest mountain I climbed was Blue Mountain. That was 3,700 feet, and there was still trees there. I think the ones around the Adirondack Lodge, were in the 4,000 and 5,000. Those are probably, you're getting into the alpine territory. I know they're always making you very aware that even though they're not high, they're very dangerous. The Adirondack Mountain Club publishes a magazine. I was leafing through it at the lodge, and there's one section about, they list all the kind of rescues they had to do and how people, didn't do smart things like let someone else know where they're going or travel with a friend or come down, by nighttime. So they've had to do some, get people out of some dangerous situations. So even though it's not high, it could be a risky situation if you're not doing the right things in that environment. And it can get certainly cold.
Yep. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
So Tom, there's some questions in the chat.
Oh, okay.
One of them is, did you get to see any Erie Canal history sites along that part of the trip?
Well, nothing other than the lock and a few kiosks. My segment of that trail was about 20 miles, and it extends all the way to Buffalo, which is, I don't know how many more hundreds of miles. So not a whole lot. And there may have been some others that I just didn't stop at earlier on, but yeah, I mean, not very much.
Okay.
My nephew had taken that trip. I think he went all the way from Albany to Buffalo following that trail. And I think he found it to be a pretty neat experience.
Yeah. So another question is, what was the most challenging part of the trip?
Well, other than realizing I had to haul my gear, a quarter of a mile at the beginning of the trip, I think this part of the Adirondacks high peaks wilderness, where the terrain got much steeper and rougher, like some of the grades were 10%, 13%, so the climbing was more challenging. That was probably the most difficult part. I mean, I didn't have the gear, the preparation to do a lot of mountain climbing, so I didn't attempt to go up into the alpine wilderness or whatever. I was pretty cognizant of staying within my limits, and I was hiking by myself, so I didn't want to be one of those people they wrote about in the magazine about some dumb person from the Midwest, having to get rescued on the mountainside.